At the age of 55, Gabriela Sabatini is still remembered as one of the brightest icons in the history of world tennis, a player who once reached number 3 on the WTA rankings and left her mark with 27 singles titles and 14 doubles titles in her professional career, in which the shining peak was the US Open Championship in 1990 when she defeated Steffi Graf, the world number 1 at that time, in an iconic final match, affirming her position among a golden generation of women's tennis. Not stopping there, Sabatini also won the Olympic silver medal in Seoul 1988, consistently advanced deep in Grand Slam tournaments like Wimbledon and Roland Garros, becoming one of the most familiar faces in major semifinals and finals, with an elegant playing style, perfect technique, and calm demeanor that made her seen as the embodiment of grace on the court. At the same time, she was inducted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame in 2006, becoming a source of pride for Argentina and a global icon not only in sports but also in popular culture, as her image appeared on prestigious magazines and international advertising campaigns, turning her into one of the most influential female athletes of her era. But behind all that glory was a journey full of pressures and pain that few could see, because from when she was still a little girl, Sabatini had to carry on her shoulders the expectations of an entire nation, had to grow up too soon in a world where every victory was celebrated and every defeat was magnified. And for a naturally shy person, the spotlight and cheers were sometimes not joy but a burden, especially when she constantly faced defeats against Graf, those losses that made her doubt herself and feel she was always standing in the shadow of another legend. Even when she reached the peak, the feeling of loneliness never left her. When hotel rooms became familiar, shelters, when her personal life gradually became closed off and separated from the outside world. And then, at the age of 26, when many people were still on the journey seeking glory, Sabatini chose to leave it all behind, not because she no longer had the ability to win, but because she had fought too long against invisible pressures, and that decision was not the end of a career, but proof of a strong will, daring to let go when necessary to find herself again, so that she could continue a different life, where she was no longer a champion in the eyes of the world, but a person learning to live for herself. Before continuing into the story behind Gabriela Sabatini's smile, please hit subscribe and leave a heart. That is how you walk alongside a person who has quietly endured more than the world has ever seen. Buenos Aires did not begin with bright lights or rounds of applause, but began with the near absolute silence, where Gabriela Sabatini grew up as a different child, not because she was particularly outstanding, but because she was too quiet in a noisy world. Gabriela was a shy little girl, so quiet that many adults around her once thought she simply did not want to communicate, but in reality she just did not know what to say, did not know how to express the complex emotions always inside her. She lived inwardly, spending much more time alone than with friends, and if there was any place that made her feel safe, it was a corner of the tennis court, where no one required her to speak. No one demanded that she perform, only to hit the ball, repeat, and sink into the steady rhythm of the swings, where silence was no longer scary, but became a form of freedom. It was right there that her parents began to notice what Gabriela had never been aware of, that she not only liked tennis, she had a rare feel for the ball, a natural concentration, an ability to read the rhythm of the match far beyond her age, and from the moment that talent was named, her life began to change in a way that she herself could not control, because once a child is seen as a talent, she is no longer allowed to just be a child anymore. And Gabriela, although she still kept her shyness and desire to live quietly, was gradually pulled into a path where each passing day distanced her a little more from her childhood. Playtime disappeared, replaced by hours-long training schedules. Weekends that were no longer rest time, but became small tournaments where she had to face expectant eyes, comments, nods or shakes of the head from adults. And what is worth noting is that Gabriela had never really chosen this path. She was not a child who dreamed of becoming a star. She simply played because it was the only place she felt she belonged. But then that very place became what forced her to leave that sense of belonging. When tennis was no longer a game, but became a responsibility. When each shot was no longer just joy, but a test. When each match was no longer an experience, but a measure of worth. And for a sensitive little girl like Gabriela, that pressure did not need to be spoken out loud. It existed in every look, every conditional compliment, every question about the future, making her gradually understand that she was no longer playing just for herself, but playing for the expectations of others, for her family, for those who believed she could become something greater. And while the world around her began to talk about potential, about the future, about glory, Gabriela was still just a little girl trying not to disappoint anyone. A little girl learning to endure before learning to choose, learning to stay silent before learning to speak up. And that very silence became an inseparable part of who she was, because instead of resisting, she accepted. Instead of refusing, she continued, day after day, training session after training session, tournament after tournament. And her childhood did not disappear in any dramatic moment. It did not end with a big event, but faded away gradually, quietly, like her own self. Until one day, when looking back, Gabriela realized that she had gone too far on that path to be able to turn back, that the years that should have been lived carefree had been replaced by discipline, by responsibility, by unspoken expectations. And what makes this story heartbreaking is not that she became a talent, but that she never really had the chance to decide whether she wanted to become that or not. Because from the beginning, she was just a little girl who liked hitting tennis balls in the quiet, and then the whole world stepped in, turning that quiet into a journey she was forced to continue. Even though, deep down, she had never truly sought it. And then, when Gabriela Sabatini turned 14, everything changed in a way that no child could prepare for. Because Argentina no longer saw her as a talented little girl anymore. They began to see her as a hope, a forming icon, a promise for the future of an entire sport thirsting for glory. The press began to call her name with phrases that Gabriela herself had not even had time to fully understand the meaning of: the future champion of Argentina. A title that sounded beautiful but carried enormous weight, because from that moment, every step she took was no longer just her own. Every match was no longer just a simple competition, but became a collective expectation where millions of eyes followed, where every shot could be praised or analyzed, where a victory could ignite national pride, and a defeat could bring heavy silence. And for a girl who was already shy, who was already used to living in her own world, that transformation was not just a step forward, but a push into a space that was too big, too noisy, too unfamiliar, where she was forced to learn how to exist before she could understand who she was becoming. When interviews began to appear, when questions about the future, about titles, about whether she could become #1 in the world were constantly asked, Gabriela did not know how to answer. Not because she lacked intelligence, but because she had never thought that far. She only knew how to play, how to train, how to try, but the world around her wanted her to become an icon, a champion, a success story. And the gap between her true self and the image people assigned to her grew larger and larger, making her gradually feel she was living in a role she had never chosen. And the pressure did not come noisily. It was not direct criticism, but expectant eyes, meaningful nods, compliments with conditions, all creating an atmosphere where failure was no longer simply part of sports, but became something almost not allowed to happen. And Gabriela, in her familiar silence, began to carry those pressures without sharing them with anyone, because she was not the type to seek comfort. She endured, she continued. She stepped onto the court every day with a gentle smile that few knew hid non-stop thoughts, questions about whether she was good enough, whether she could meet everything others were expecting. And it was in this period that her talent developed strongly. She won youth tournaments. She began to attract the attention of the tennis world, but along with that was a feeling she could not name, a feeling that every step forward brought more pressure, that every victory increased expectations even more, that there was no stopping point, no place to breathe. And what makes the story heartbreaking is that Gabriela never really resisted. She did not rebel, did not refuse. She just kept moving forward, as if that was the only thing she knew how to do, as if stopping was not an option. And while Argentina began to see in her the image of a future champion, Gabriela was still just a girl trying to keep balance between her true self and the role the world had placed on her shoulders. A role too big for a soul that was only familiar with quiet. And perhaps from that time, a silent battle began. Not between her and opponents on the court, but between her and the ever-growing expectations around her. A battle with no audience, no applause, but one that shaped her entire path in the years to come. And then, when that journey continued to push Gabriela Sabatini farther away from those initial quiet days, her teenage years no longer carried the appearance of a normal youth, because at an age when many people were still allowed to stay home, go to school, and live among family and friends, Gabriela had to leave all of that behind to step into a completely different world, a world without stability, without a sense of belonging, where home was no longer a fixed location, but only constantly changing hotel rooms, where every morning she woke up in a different city, a different country, a different time zone, and instead of classes or meetings with friends, her life revolved around tennis courts, training rooms, and long flights, where luggage was always packed and ready, where there was no time to stop, to think, or to feel, because everything happened too fast, too continuously, too pressuring, and in that whirlpool, Gabriela gradually lost the things that a normal teenager had. Those carefree afternoons, those meaningless conversations full of laughter, those moments without being judged or watched, because in her world everything was seen by someone. Every match had commentators, every result was recorded, and gradually, she was no longer just an athlete, but became an image, a name that people began to recognize, a young girl that the media began to follow, analyze, and place expectations on. And the sad thing is that all of that happened when she was still too young to understand what she was trading away, because while her peers the same age were learning to understand themselves, making mistakes, living imperfect but free years, Gabriela lived a life shaped by the match schedule, by training plans, by goals set by adults, and she did not have many opportunities to stop and ask whether she truly wanted that or not, because once you had become the hope, stopping was no longer simple. And so she continued. Day after day, the tennis court became where she spent most of her time. The training room became where her body was pushed to the limit. And the airplane became where she lived more than any other space, a life that repeated to the point of becoming almost numb, where victories no longer brought complete joy, but only temporary relief, and defeats were not just a result, but a prolonged mental burden. And amid all of that, Gabriela still kept her silence, still kept the calmness that the world praised, but few knew that that calmness was not strength, but sometimes the only way she knew to not collapse, because when you live in a world where everything is watched, every emotion can be seen, you learn to hide them, you learn to control yourself, and Gabriela had done that from very early on, too early, to the point where even she was no longer sure which was her true self and which was the version the world wanted to see. And perhaps that was the biggest price of growing up too fast. Not physical exhaustion, but the disconnection from herself. When you grow up not at a natural pace, but at the speed of expectations. And while the whole world began to see in Gabriela Sabatini a rising star, a talent in full bloom, a bright future inside, she was just a young girl trying to keep balance in a life she had never had the chance to slow down and understand, a girl learning to endure before learning to live, and that, in a very quiet way, had shaped who she became for the rest of her life. And then, when that journey seemed difficult enough, another shadow began to appear bigger, stronger, and almost impossible to overcome, the shadow of Steffi Graf, who was not only an outstanding player, but also the symbol of absolute dominance in women's tennis at that time. As Graf rose to become the world #1 at a speed that was almost unbelievable, she brought with her a cold, precise, unrelenting playing style. And each of her victories seemed to reinforce one thing, that the media began to repeat over and over. This was the standard. This was the peak. And anyone standing on the other side of the net was just someone trying to reach something almost impossible. And among those people, Gabriela Sabatini was the name mentioned the most, not only because of her talent, not only because of her artistic playing style, but also because of the complete contrast between the two. If Graf was the embodiment of strength and iron discipline, then Sabatini was softness, emotion, and sometimes fragility, and that very contrast created a story that the media never stopped exploiting, a rivalry not only on the court, but also in the way the world perceived them, where every time the two met, it was not just a match, but a test. A question put before millions of spectators: could Sabatini overcome Graf or not? And sadly, the answer in most of those times was no. Each defeat was not just a number on the scoreboard, but a story rewritten in the same way. She was close, but never enough. A phrase that seemed harmless but carried the weight of denial, of always standing right at the threshold of success, but never truly touching it. And over time, that phrase did not just exist on newspaper pages, but gradually seeped into Gabriela's own thoughts. Because when you hear something repeated enough times, it begins to become part of how you see yourself. And for a person who was already sensitive, who was already used to keeping everything inside, that pressure did not explode. It accumulated, little by little, quietly but deeply, making each time she stepped onto the court not only facing an opponent, but also facing an invisible fear, the fear that no matter how hard she tried, she would still only be the one standing behind. And while the world began to attach another title to her, the beautiful challenger, a phrase that sounded honoring but was actually a frame, an invisible limit, where she was recognized but never seen as the real winner, where her beauty and style were praised, but her strength and ability to break through the final barrier were doubted. And that created a special pressure, a pressure that came not only from having to win, but from having to prove that she was not just a beautiful image on the court, that she was not just the one who almost succeeded, that she deserved more than what people were assigning to her. And the more she tried to escape that shadow, the bigger the shadow became. Because each defeat against Graf was not just a loss, but a reinforcement of the story the world had decided to believe. And Gabriela, in her familiar silence, did not argue back, did not dispute. She just continued to compete, continued to train, continued to step onto the court, with the hope that one day that story would change. But deep inside, the psychological pressure had begun to leave its marks, not visible wounds, but doubts, moments of lack of confidence, moments and she was no longer sure about herself. And that was the hardest battle. Because when the opponent no longer only stood across the net, but also existed inside your own mind, then each match was not just a competition, but a test of belief. And in this period, Gabriela Sabatini was not only trying to become a champion, she was trying to prove that she was not the shadow of anyone, even when the whole world seemed to have decided the opposite. And then, when the shadow of Steffi Graf grew bigger and bigger in the tennis world, Gabriela Sabatini's journey also entered a phase full of painful paradoxes. Because she was not a failure in the usual sense, on the contrary, she consistently advanced deep into the biggest tournaments in the world, those stages that any player would dream of stepping onto. She reached semifinals, finals, stood at the threshold of glory time after time. But what made everything heavier was that the door seemed to always close right before she could walk through. The biggest victory, the Grand Slam title that the whole world was waiting for, seemed always so close, but never truly belonged to her for a long time. And each time like that, each time stepping off the court as the loser in a big match, that feeling was not just disappointment, but something deeper, more lingering, a feeling that even she herself could hardly describe, because it was not that she was not good enough, but that she had been so close to the peak, close enough to see it clearly, but could not touch it, and that very close but not enough became a special kind of pressure, because it made everyone around begin to expect more, and when expectations rose, each defeat became many times heavier. The media no longer simply reported. They began to analyze, began to question, began to repeat the familiar phrases that Sabatini had everything to become a champion, except actually becoming a champion. And for a sensitive person like her, those comments did not pass harmlessly. They stayed, they settled, and gradually turned into inner voices, voices that began to doubt, began to ask whether she was really good enough, whether there was something missing in her that she could not see. And each time she stepped into a big match, she brought not only her racket and skills, but also all those questions, all those expectations, all those fears. And that made the match no longer just a physical competition, but a psychological battle, where just one moment of lack of confidence could change the entire situation. And when defeat happened, it did not end there. It lingered. It repeated in her thoughts, in the long nights when she could not sleep, in the moments she had to face herself without spectators, without applause, only silence and non-stop thoughts. And while the outside world still saw her as one of the top players, someone always present in the final rounds, Gabriela began to see herself through a different lens, a lens shaped by what she had not achieved rather than what she had done. And that was what made this period so painful, because she not only had to face opponents on the court, but also had to face a version of herself that was gradually losing faith, a version that always wondered if she was missing something that others had, something that could help her cross the final line. And the more she tried to find the answer, the deeper she sank into the vortex of doubt and pressure. Because in the world of elite sports, there is no room for hesitation, and for Gabriela Sabatini, who always felt everything more deeply than others, those defeats were not just losses, but silent cuts into her confidence. Cuts that did not bleed, but left long-lasting marks, making each time she stood before a big opportunity. She not only fought to win, but also fought to believe that she deserved that victory. And that was a battle that sometimes, no matter how great the talent, was not easy to win. And then, after all those years living in the shadow of doubt, after all those defeats that made her wonder if she would ever be good enough, that night finally came, a night when everything seemed to converge. Not just a match, but a destined moment, where Gabriela Sabatini stepped onto the court of the US Open in 1990 to face the person she had become too familiar with, Steffi Graf. But this time, the feeling was no longer like before, no longer hesitation, no longer the invisible shadow weighing on every movement, because after all those defeats, after all those times of close but not enough, something inside Gabriela had changed. Not technique, not physical strength, but the way she looked at herself. And when the match began, everything unfolded, not only as a competition between two players, but like a dialogue between the past and the present, between fear and belief. Each shot was not just a reflex, but a release. Each point was not just a step forward, but an affirmation that she was no longer the girl standing behind. And when the match reached the decisive moments, when the pressure reached its peak, where in the past she had once collapsed, this time Gabriela did not step back. She did not let old memories pull her back, did not let doubting voices overpower. She continued, point by point, moment by moment, until what the whole world had waited for but few truly believed would happen, finally became reality. She defeated Graf. She won the US Open Championship, and in that moment, when the match ended, when all sounds seemed to stop for a brief second, Gabriela did not immediately raise her hand to celebrate. She did not run toward the stands. She stood there, then slowly brought her hand up to cover her face, as if even she could not believe that this had happened. And then tears began to fall. Not tears of simple victory, but tears accumulated from many years, from sleepless nights, from moments of self-doubt, from defeats she had carried for too long, all bursting out in a single moment, when she knelt down, when she covered her face on the court. That was not just the image of a champion, but the image of a person who had finally escaped the burden she had carried for so many years. Because this victory was not just a title, not just a trophy, but a release, an affirmation that she was not the most beautiful runner-up, that she was not the shadow of anyone, that everything she had endured, everything she had quietly overcome, finally had meaning. And in that moment, the whole world saw Gabriela Sabatini as a champion, but only she understood that she had just won something much greater, her own fear itself. And perhaps that was the hardest victory, and also the most important victory in her entire life. And then, what many people believed would change everything, what the whole world called the peak, did not bring the peace that Gabriela Sabatini had quietly been searching for throughout those long years. Because after the glorious night at the US Open in 1990, when she walked off the court with a Grand Slam title in hand, her life did not slow down, did not become gentler, but on the contrary, it opened a new chapter that was even harsher, where she was no longer the one trying to prove herself anymore, but had become an icon, a global superstar that every eye followed, every step was recorded, every word was analyzed, and from that moment, victory was no longer the end point of pressure, but became the beginning of another form of pressure, heavier, quieter, and harder to escape, because when you had reached the peak, the world did not allow you to fall. They no longer asked whether you could win or not, but assumed that you must continue winning. And for a person who was naturally sensitive and introverted like Gabriela, that transition did not bring a feeling of freedom, but felt like being placed in an invisible cage, where she had to continue existing in the spotlight that she had never truly felt comfortable with. The interviews became denser. Advertising contracts began to appear. Her image flooded magazines, television, and billboards where she herself sometimes did not even recognize herself in them. And the paradox was that while the whole world was seeing a Gabriela Sabatini more radiant than ever, inside she was still the shy girl from Buenos Aires, still felt awkward in front of crowds, still was not used to being the center of attention, and that very mismatch created an ever-growing gap between her true self and the image the world was expecting. A gap that became harder to close with each passing day, because she could not go back to being anonymous. But she also did not completely belong to the role of a superstar, and in that in-between space, the pressure did not disappear. It only changed shape, from having to prove herself to having to maintain the image, from fearing failure to fearing not meeting expectations anymore. And along with that was a quiet anxiety that she did not easily share, because to outsiders she had everything: titles, recognition, admiration. But for Gabriela, those things did not automatically bring peace, did not erase the doubts that had existed for too long, did not make the feeling disappear that she still had to try to deserve everything she had. And so she continued to step onto the court, continued to compete, continued to smile in front of the cameras, but behind each smile was an effort, behind each match was an inner battle, because the biggest victory in her career had not brought what she thought she would find: relief, liberation, quietness. And that was the most painful paradox. When you achieve what the whole world calls a dream but still feel that something is missing, a void that no title could fill. And while the stage lights continued to shine, Gabriela Sabatini continued to stand there, no longer the girl finding her way to the peak, but a person trying to keep balance between glory and her own self, between the expectations of the world and the quiet she had always longed for but had never truly reached. And then, amid all that light, amid the non-stop applause and the praises that seemed never to end, another battle began to form inside Gabriela Sabatini, a battle with no audience, no scoreboard, no clear winner, only silence and emotions she could not easily name, because behind the image of a champion that the world saw, Gabriela had to face quiet anxiety attacks, performance pressures that came not only from outside, but also from herself, and a feeling of loneliness that became deeper the more famous she became. Because fame, instead of bringing people closer, sometimes created distance, a distance she did not know how to fill, and for a person who was already sensitive, who was already used to keeping everything inside, those emotions did not explode, they accumulated, little by little, seeping into every day, every match, every moment she stepped onto the court in front of thousands of people waiting. And what they did not know was that the very crowd which, for many athletes, was a source of motivation, was one of the things that scared her the most, because Gabriela once admitted that standing in front of too many eyes made her feel uncomfortable, made her heart beat faster, made her thoughts become chaotic, and in those moments, she was no longer the champion everyone saw. She was just a girl trying to control herself, trying to stay calm, trying not to let fear take over. And that very contrast between the outer image and the inner feeling created a pressure that not everyone could understand. Because when you are seen as an icon, you do not have much space to be weak. You cannot easily admit that you are scared, that you are not okay, that you are fighting invisible things. And Gabriela, with her reserved nature, shared even less. She did not seek attention for her pain. She did not turn her struggles into stories to tell. She kept them inside, carried them with her, and continued to step onto the court as if nothing was happening. But each match, each point, each moment of pressure left marks, not on her body, but in her mind, making her gradually feel that she was not only competing with the opponent across the net, but also competing with her own thoughts, with the fear of failure, with the feeling of not being good enough, with the question that kept repeating in her head whether she could maintain everything she had achieved or not. And while the audience saw a confident champion, an elegant woman who controlled everything perfectly on the court, Gabriela felt like she was walking on a thin rope, where just one moment of imbalance could make everything collapse. And that was why each victory no longer brought complete joy, but came with the relief that she had overcome one more challenge, one more day, one more match, and each defeat became a heavy blow to the fears that already existed, forcing her to start over, to rebuild her confidence, to convince herself that she could still continue. And what made this battle especially painful was that it had no clear ending, no moment when she could say she had completely won, because even when she stood at the peak, even when she won titles that others dreamed of, the inner battle continued, quietly but persistently, as an inseparable part of who she was. And perhaps that was exactly what the world rarely realized, that behind every perfect shot, every confident movement, was a person trying every day to keep herself from collapsing, not in front of opponents, but in front of the fears she had carried long before she became a champion. In 1996, a year that many fans still remember as the end of an era, Gabriela Sabatini, at the age of 26, made a decision that the whole world could hardly understand. She left tennis, left the spotlight, left the rounds of applause, the advertising contracts, the titles, and all the expectations that an entire nation had placed on her shoulders since she was still a teenager. And to the public, that was a shock, because a girl who had just won the US Open, who had become a global icon, no one thought she could give up everything while at the peak of her career. But for Gabriela, that decision did not come from failure, did not come from physical exhaustion, but came from a quiet feeling that had followed her for many years. A feeling that even though she had achieved every title, even though the world praised her, she still could not find inner peace, that the bright lights of the court and the media attention could never fill the emptiness in her soul, that she had spent too many years trying to please the expectations of others, to win for fame, for the pride of Argentina, for the numbers on the rankings, but had never truly lived for herself. And at one point, she realized that to find herself again, to breathe, to live, to feel life the way a normal girl was allowed to experience, she had to stop, had to step away from everything, had to stop before it was too late. And that was not an easy decision, because it meant giving up what everyone had seen as the greatest achievement in her life, giving up what had proven she was one of the best players in the world, giving up both the spotlight and the fame. But deep down, it was the only thing she could do to find herself again, to stop running after endless expectations, to be able to hear her own voice, to relearn how to feel the youth she had missed. And when she announced that decision to the world, the reactions were varied. Some people were stunned, some people regretted it, but few could understand that this was not running away, not failure, but the courageous act of a person who knew that to live fully, sometimes you have to know how to let go. And in the weeks and months after that decision, Gabriela began to build a new life, a life that she could choose, where the court was no longer the center, where the spotlight was no longer the measure of worth, where she could focus on the things that were truly important to her: learning, business, taking care of her health, traveling, and sometimes simply enjoying the peaceful moments she had once dreamed of. And although the public still remembered her with the US Open title, with the world #3 ranking, with the wonderful matches against Steffi Graf, but for Gabriela, the most important thing at that moment was not what others saw, but that she had dared to stand up and tell herself that she deserved to live for herself, that she deserved to be free from the pressure that her youth had stolen, that a woman could be a champion on the court, but still needed to be a normal girl in life. And that decision, even though it shocked the whole world, opened a new chapter, where she began to discover new possibilities, found serenity, learned how to balance between the glorious past and the peaceful present. And most importantly, for the first time in many years, she felt that she was living for herself, that she was no longer a victim of expectations, but the person in control of her own life. And in that silence, Gabriela Sabatini had found a kind of victory that no title could bring. Victory for herself, and then, after leaving the spotlight and the non-stop cheers of the stands, Gabriela Sabatini stepped into a completely different world. A world with no more scoreboards, no more referees, no more direct opponents, where she had to learn how to stand on her own 2 feet without relying on the achievements that once made her name, where life no longer revolved around perfect shots or brilliant victories, but around the normal, everyday choices that a young girl who had her childhood stolen could truly understand. And to do that, Gabriela began trying her hand at new fields. First in business, she launched a perfume brand under her own name, a line of products that quickly became famous in Europe and Latin America. But this success did not come easily, because for Gabriela, this was not just about selling a product, but a way for her to search for a new identity, a place where talent and fame were no longer pressure, but a means for her to shape her own life. At the same time, she also got involved in social activities, participating in charity programs for children, events to promote sports for young people, and gradually, she realized that helping others brought her a sense of peace that tennis had never given her. But beside that, life after the spotlight was not as easy as many people thought, because adapting to a normal pace of life where no one cared about every step or every decision she made was a new challenge, a mental challenge no less than the tense matches on the court. Gabriela had to relearn simple daily routines, learn how to cook, learn how to manage her time, learn how to enjoy herself without needing recognition from millions of spectators. And in those first years, she often felt lost, felt empty, because her mind had become too used to praise, evaluation, and constant expectations. Now everything was just her own choices. And it was precisely in that silence that she began to find the real value of life. That joy did not necessarily come from titles or glory, but from small moments, from genuine smiles, from sincere connections with those around her. Gabriela also realized that fame that lasted too long could isolate a person, but when she actively chose to step back, she truly felt freedom, peace, and sometimes simple happiness. She spent a lot of time traveling, exploring places she had never been, spending time with friends and the people she loved, while maintaining contact with old colleagues in the tennis world. But now it was no longer competition or pressure, but simply sharing. And in each business project, each charity activity, Gabriela gradually realized that she no longer had to prove herself anymore, that her value did not lie in what she had achieved on the court, but in the way she lived, the way she loved, the way she brought joy and inspiration to others, and most importantly, for the first time in many years, she felt that she could live for herself, that she had the right to choose, and that the real light in life did not necessarily come from thousands of spectators, but from inner satisfaction, from the simple moments she had once dreamed of, from realizing that every day lived fully, every genuine smile, every kind action was more important than any title. And that was the lesson that Gabriela Sabatini carried with her, that sometimes, to find yourself, you have to dare to leave the spotlight, dare to step into silence, and dare to live as a real human being, without needing the attention or judgment of anyone. Even though she had stepped away from the spotlight and become a woman who freely chose her own life, Gabriela Sabatini still carried on her shoulders a price that no one saw the price of a global icon, where every step she took was scrutinized, every decision was evaluated. And that was why she chose to keep her private life as private as possible, never marrying, rarely appearing in the media, to protect the peace of her soul and the freedom she had traded so much to obtain. Because, for a person who had lived under enormous pressure since her teenage years, who had once had to step onto the court in front of thousands of watching eyes, separation became the only way she could breathe, and most of the time, Gabriela dedicated time to herself, to long-distance trips where she was not seen, where the sound of the wind, the waves, or natural landscapes became her companions, where she could reflect on what had passed, on the failures, on the victories, on the childhood she had missed, and on herself. Those trips were not just entertainment, but also therapy, a way to reorganize her mind, to balance between the glorious past and the quiet present. And in those moments, she looked back on her tennis years, the endless training hours, the painful defeats against Steffi Graf, to realize that everything she had been through was not meaningless, that the pressure and loneliness had shaped a person who was strong but also deeply sensitive, a person capable of feeling the beauty and value of every moment profoundly. And although the outside world saw a radiant icon, inside, Gabriela was still the young girl who had once been shy, once lonely, once had to find ways to survive through every match, every watchful eye. And this very separation allowed her to maintain the balance between the image the public loved and her true self, because without that silence, she would not be able to live fully, would not be able to feel the simple joys that had once been covered by the shadow of pressure. And when traveling, when sitting by the sea or gazing at distant landscapes, she allowed herself to think about her choices, about the paths she had taken, about the things she had lost, but also about what she had regained. And in these moments, loneliness was no longer a fear but became a friend, a state for her to face herself, to understand that keeping her privacy was not avoidance, but a way to protect her own value. And therefore, with each passing day, Gabriela Sabatini found peace in silence, found strength in stillness, and learned that sometimes being an icon was not only about standing at the peak, but also about knowing how to live with herself, knowing how to enjoy moments when no one was watching, knowing how to care for her soul with quietness, reflection, and the trips she chose to connect with her inner self. And it was precisely from this chosen solitude that Gabriela not only survived the pressure-filled tennis years, but also found a way to exist with dignity, a way to hold herself steady in a world that always looked at her with admiring eyes, and in that stillness she realized that solitude, when chosen, could become a source of strength, a way to recreate herself, a place to balance between the glorious past, the victories and defeats with the peaceful present, where Gabriela could be herself, not because of titles or glory, but simply because she deserved to live her life fully. In the years after leaving the spotlight and becoming a global icon, Gabriela Sabatini began to realize that the relationships around her, even with family, were no longer the same as before, because fame, success, and a busy life had created distances she could not fill. And for many years, between her and the loved ones she had once been close to, there were quiet tensions, misunderstandings, unmet expectations, and each time she thought about facing or arguing, Gabriela realized that she no longer wanted to turn her life into a series of conflicts. That silence, keeping distance, even if it sounded cold, was the only way to protect herself and preserve the serenity she had learned to seek from very early on, because she understood that sometimes staying silent was not concession or running away, but a strategy, a way to maintain peace and not let conflicts hurt her anymore, and therefore, instead of engaging in meaningless arguments or trying to fix every misunderstanding, she chose to separate herself, to live with just enough distance so she could think, so she could recover, and so she could exist in the way she desired. That distance was not abandonment, but a form of protection, a way for her to control what she could control. And in that silence, Gabriela found quietness, freedom, and also the opportunity to look back at herself, to look back at the years that had passed, from her shy childhood in Buenos Aires, from the first days on the court, from the defeats against Steffi Graf, to the U.S. Open peak and the pressure of millions of eyes. All of it came up in her mind, but now she was no longer swept away by it. She could think independently, choose what was important, choose the people who truly deserved to be in her life, and in that distance, she found clarity, a way to distinguish between real values and things that were only images, fame, or the expectations of others. At the same time, the distance also gave her time to heal herself, to find the parts of herself that had been lost, to learn how to balance between memories, between the glorious past and the quiet present. And in that silence, Gabriela realized that life did not always need to be proven, that her value no longer depended on the eyes of others, and that sometimes simply living the way she wanted, maintaining healthy relationships, and choosing what to participate in, was the way to overcome the pressures she had carried from the past, from the years when her youth was stolen, from the years when she had to learn to grow up too soon. And it was precisely in that distance, in the silence and stillness she chose, that Gabriela Sabatini found freedom, found the strength to move forward, found the ability to live a complete life where she was no longer bound by the pressures of others, where she could be herself, and where the past, even though it had once hurt her, no longer controlled her, because she had learned how to stand firm, learned how to stay silent, learned how to walk to the rhythm of her own. And that was the quiet victory she had won for herself. At the age of 55, Gabriela Sabatini is no longer the shy girl who once stepped onto the court under bright lights with a heart full of anxiety. She is no longer the image the whole world once knew, but a woman who has been through enough pressure failure, and loneliness to learn how to find peace, to understand that victory does not always mean happiness, and that the real value of a person does not lie in titles or glory, but in the way that person lives, the way that person faces themselves, and the way that person loves what is around them. Gabriela had learned acceptance. Acceptance that the past, with the years of stolen youth, the painful losses against Steffi Graf, the enormous expectations from Argentina, all of it had shaped the person she is today. And instead of resenting or trying to change what could not be changed, she chose to live with reality, with what she had been through, and to find ways to balance between the glorious past, the peaceful present, and the unknown future. She no longer chased victories on the court or public recognition, but chased her own rhythm, chased what truly brought meaning to life. And that meant she spent time taking care of her health, enjoying trips, connecting with friends and the people she loved, participating in charity and business activities in ways that brought value. And in that process, Gabriela found the freedom she had never had when she was a talented but shy teenager. The freedom to step out of the shadow she had once been placed in, and the peace to look back on her tennis years without regret or remorse. Because she understood that everything that happened, both good and bad, had contributed to creating the person she is today. A woman who is strong but still sensitive, decisive but still knows how to cherish quietness, and most importantly, she learned that balance is not about stopping effort, but about knowing how to choose, knowing how to distinguish between what is important and what is not, between what can be changed and what cannot. And from that balance, Gabriela built a life where she could live true to herself, where she could smile without feeling guilty, where she could look back at failures without being haunted, where she could feel victory without pressure, and above all, she found a kind of happiness that once seemed distant, happiness from freedom, from the ability to choose, from the peaceful moments she fully owned, from the ability to live a life with its own meaning. And that is exactly the person she has become, a Gabriela Sabatini no longer dominated by glory or fame, but living fully to her own rhythm, a woman at peace, accepting and completely deserving of all the glory she once achieved. And then, when looking back at the entire journey, people see that Gabriela Sabatini was not the player who won the most Grand Slams, was not the one who dominated the rankings for a long time, but those numbers could never express her true value, because Gabriela turned every match, every training hour, every defeat, and every drop of sweat into a story about inner strength, about patience, and about how a person can overcome enormous pressures that youth had to endure. She became a symbol of elegance, a role model not only on the court but also in everyday life, where every gesture, every step, every smile radiated calmness, grace, and qualities that many people search for their whole lives and still find hard to achieve. And what makes Gabriela's legacy special is not the titles, but the ability to overcome difficulties that could not be seen, the pressure from the expectations of an entire nation, the losses against opponents who seemed impossible to overcome, the loneliness that fame brought, and the feeling of losing her childhood that most ordinary people never experience. She learned how to stand up after every defeat, learned how to smile even when her heart was broken, learned how to keep moving forward, even when the whole world seemed to be waiting for her to collapse. And that was exactly what created a strength no one could take away, an inspiration not limited by numbers or medals. Outside the court, Gabriela continued to live a meaningful life. She got involved in charity activities, built a successful perfume brand. But above all, she kept the privacy and stillness that she had traded so much to obtain. She learned how to enjoy peaceful moments, from trips, quiet mornings to sincere conversations with friends, to reflecting on life and herself. And that turned Gabriela into a mature, balanced woman, not chasing fame or pressure, but knowing how to cherish the real value of life. And in that way, She became a role model for the young generation of athletes, for those who were learning how to face pressure, failure, and loneliness. She taught that the greatest victory is not winning a title, but knowing how to live fully, knowing how to preserve dignity and inner peace, and seeing every difficult moment as part of the journey, every challenge as an opportunity to grow, and every fall as an opportunity to stand up stronger. Gabriela Sabatini's legacy, therefore, is not just the trophies or the brilliant victories on the court, but a reminder that elegance, resilience, and the ability to hold oneself steady in every situation, whether lonely, whether failing, whether under pressure, are qualities more valuable than any glory. And when looking at Gabriela at the age of 55, people see an icon not only of tennis, but also of life. A person who had fought quietly but relentlessly, overcome the years of stolen youth, the painful defeats, the invisible pressures, and the loneliness that fame brought. And from everything she had been through, the world learned a lesson that a real victory is not measured by medals or awards, but measured by the ability to live fully, to love, to be patient, and to hold on to dignity. And that is exactly the legacy that Gabriela Sabatini left behind, a legacy that cannot be quantified by numbers, but has powerful reach, inspiring anyone who has ever faced pressure, failure, or loneliness. And in the eyes of those who once followed her on the court, in the hearts of those who learned from her resilience and elegance, that legacy still lives on, reminding everyone that the greatest glory is not what the world gives you, but what you hold steady for yourself. The story of Gabriela Sabatini makes readers not only admire but also full of compassion, because behind every title, every victory, is a journey full of quiet sacrifices, invisible pressures that few can imagine. From a shy childhood in Buenos Aires, where she liked quietness but had to face great expectations from her family, to the years becoming a tennis prodigy, having to leave her family, living in hotels, flying around the world to compete, Gabriela had traded her childhood and peace to live for the dreams that the world placed on her shoulders. The defeats against Steffi Graf, the matches where she was always close but never enough, once broke her heart, filled her mind with pressure and self-doubt. But those very challenges forged her will, created resilience and courage in her. When she won the US Open in 1990, people only saw a brilliant victory, but for Gabriela, it was a moment of release, proof that she could overcome all pressure, all fears. After leaving tennis, she continued to challenge herself through business, charity, and learning how to live a normal life, but still kept distance from the media and public opinion to protect the peace of her soul. Gabriela Sabatini's story reminds us, especially the American audience, that success is not just awards or titles, but the ability to overcome adversity, to hold on to dignity, and to find balance between responsibility, pressure, and oneself. The precious lesson from her is: dare to step out of the spotlight, to live true to yourself, dare to face failure without giving up, and know how to cherish inner values without depending on the eyes of others. Please hit subscribe and leave a heart to walk alongside the extraordinary but lonely and resilient journey of Gabriela Sabatini, an icon not only of sports, but also of willpower and dignity. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video to explore more personal stories and the quiet challenges of legends who overcame adversity to shine.